This is a perennial digression, an extended experiments in imposing my thinly undiagnosed ADHD on others. My name is David Armstrong, but more importantly, I'm joined by Addo Abrahams, Associate Director of Campus Ministry at Pres House, Antiracism educator, and at this point, my longtime friend. Buddy, it's good to see your face. I'm really regretful that the number of weddings we're likely to bump into each other at has now more or less dwindled down to zero.
Yeah, it's hard, folks start getting married right around the time that I decide to up and move across to the East Coast, and now I'm in Wisconsin. So
Yeah, I think the last time I saw you was probably at our mutual friends Michael and Carly's weddings. And I think I had this depressing thought then, actually, was like, oh, I don't know anyone else that's getting married that like I'm likely to be invited to that wedding, then he's also going to be there,
yeah. And even us getting to that wedding was kind of a whirlwind, like getting there from New Jersey, and just like, the simple things of how do you afford a flight when you and your partner are both graduate students?
Gosh, it's the worst. It's the worst. So I feel like you probably experienced this too, right? I went from the grad program at Missouri State to the grad program at WashU. And whereas in the first one, I did the graduate thing, right? Like I was just fully invested in school all the time. In the second one, I committed the cardinal sin of grad school, by which I mean I worked like 30 hours a week in addition to being in grad school.
Indeed.
And I felt like I was only kind of half doing it,
Yeah, when I was doing the same when I was at Missouri State, though I did have a side job at Missouri State, but it was mostly in the mornings, and so it didn't really interfere with school or grad student responsibilities. And when I was at Princeton, I worked too, but all of my jobs were at the seminary. And so it was this very weird thing where it was like I was kind of a graduate assistant, but I wasn't. And then eventually I was a graduate assistant in addition to doing all these other things. And it definitely, like, by the time my last year in seminary came around, I was like, wow, I am grateful for all the things that I've learned and the opportunities that I've had through the jobs that I've had, but I don't think I would do this again.
Yeah. The only way I'm going back to academia is if I like somehow become independently wealthy. So this is a good time to plug. Go subscribe to A Perennial Digression, everybody. Because it is just the case that, one of my buddies once told me the reason he didn't do a PhD was he didn't want his wife to basically be like a serf, He didn't want to subject his family to peasant life. And that's unfortunately what you have to do. I mean, a lot of the people I've known in academia are either single or they're in like irregular kind of marital situations, right? Or they don't have families and kids. And I remember one professor telling me like, oh, well, you can do all that while getting a PhD. And I was like, you can do all that while getting a PhD, right? Because you did it in the 80s.
Yeah. The world looks very, very different. Like I don't think PhD programs have quite caught up to the fact that like most people coming into programs have like large amounts of student debt and like cannot afford to find a house when they move to wherever city they're going to move to. And certainly, with all of like the family and the family responsibilities and like just having to have a job to survive, it's not really a realistic picture anymore, but it is still interesting to me. And I'm curious what it was like at WashU, because when I was at Princeton, and maybe it's just because of the institution that I was at, but like the number of people who came in were like, no, I'm definitely getting a PhD, including myself. I was like, oh, for sure. I know everyone says doom and gloom. It's really hard. It's not realistic, but me, I am special. I will be able to do it. And then after like a year and a half, I was like, I don't know. And by my third year, it was like, yeah, definitely not. It's off the table.
Yeah, so the way it worked at WashU Classics was there were two tracks. Like you could either go in planning to get the PhD or you could go through and get a master's. And if you went through and got the master's, the implication was you're either going to go do a PhD somewhere else or you're not doing a PhD. And so I just went in for the master's because I was like, look, the plan was always do a second master's degree in classics, and if I can keep doing more stuff than that afterwards in, you know, theology, New Testament, whatever, awesome. And if I can't, then minimally, like, I've got a master's in religion and a master's in classics, right?
Right.
Pretty good. And I think actually, like, the students who went in planning to do a PhD, who were completely brilliant people, and most of whom I think have finished at this point. I mean, they were very conscious, I think, of the fact that, like, yeah, look, I mean, I'm committing to this, you know what I mean? Like, this is like a lifestyle choice at this point. And I think most of the master's students were, well, it was different because, like, I had come out of a master's program where I already had a degree, and most of my cohort were people who were coming out of their undergrad into, like, their first grad school experience. So I remember being in the grad office there, very different from our grad office, by the way, because it's all this, like, dark hardwood, and I'm, like, looking out my window at, like, you know, like a brick chapel and all this stuff, and I'm like, wow, this is magic. I mean, compared to the architectural brutalism of Missouri State, like, this is
amazing. It's very different vibes for sure.
Yeah. I'm sure you've experienced something parallel at, like, Princeton, right?
Yeah, though it's very interesting, like, aesthetically, the outside of most buildings at Princeton is, like, kind of what you would expect for Princeton. It's like an Ivy League school, so there is Ivy everywhere. But then you, like, walk into buildings and it's like you could have chosen to, like, lean into what the outside suggests, but you didn't. You just sort of, like, aimed for, like, kind of modernizing and then stopped halfway. So aside from the library, which is very beautiful and it was one of my favorite places to work and study and all that sort of stuff, every other building on campus was, like, not that aesthetically pleasing, at least on the inside. And the building where we had most of our classes, Stewart Hall, really was, like, I mean, it reminded me, at least the inside reminded me just, like, a lot of being in a classroom at Missouri State, to be honest.
Yeah, I think WashU is a mix. So, like, some buildings, I remember I was lost one day. I was trying to find a classroom that I was supposed to go be in to help welcome some, you know, prospects for the program, I guess. And I'm just wandering around, and I end up in this room that's got this, like, these huge ornate, like, squares on the ceiling. Somebody's going to watch this and know what I'm talking about and be like, that's such a stupid way to describe that. Like, that's what it was, right? And it was, like, hardwood floors and a big grand piano and, like, a huge fireplace. And I just, like, happened upon it. I'm just, like, walking through. There are people just hanging out, and I was just like, oh, you know. So this is what, like, generations of way too much money can do. And then there were other places at WashU that are just like, yeah, like, they're no different than a Missouri State classroom. The one aesthetic advantage to every classroom I was in at WashU, though, was that they all had blackboards. And I'm very convinced that there's something, there's a tactile superiority to the blackboard over the whiteboard. I wince about this every time I have to draw something on the whiteboard for my students. Like, I could be doing this on Blackboard, but sorry, guys.
You like the click clack and the dust.
Yeah. Yes.
It was really interesting. Princeton had, so I while I was at Princeton, I retook Greek my first year, mostly because I was like, this will be a very easy class. And those classrooms had blackboards, but then there were others that had whiteboards, and then there were a lot of smart boards at Princeton, which was really funny to me because you could definitely tell that all of these were purchased at that space in time around, like, 2011, 2012, when everyone was like, smart boards are the future. And so they invested really hard, and then 3 years later, it turns out smart boards were not the future. And so most of the time people just use them as whiteboards, which you're not supposed to do because it, like, ruins the smart board. So there are signs everywhere like, please do not use this as a whiteboard. And then underneath that sign is, like, a tray of markers to use the smart board as a whiteboard.
Yeah, that's reminding me of every other week when I get together with my buddies to do D&D. So my friend built an actual table for us to play Dungeons and Dragons on. In the middle of it, there's like a flat screen TV, and he's our DM. But every time he looks away, my one friend who's a tattoo artist and also just like I guess a general artist, I don't know. Every time he looks away, he'll like pull out an expo marker and he'll circle something he's interested in on the board. It's like, dude, like your TVs are not made to do this. What are you doing?
Yeah, that's not, it's the wrong screen, man.
Yeah. So, okay, lots of fun. The conversation I pitched to you today is broadly on your work as like an anti-racism educator. Me being me, you being you, I'm certain that theology is going to like ground and direct that conversation to some extent. I wanted to start though just hearing about how this came to be part of your vocation and how your background has influenced you on this point. Super weird to think about the fact that I've known you for like 8 or 9 years at this point, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But you know, like me, you grew up in Missouri. Unlike me, you grew up in Joplin rather than St. Louis. Also, unlike me, your parents and grandparents are from Ghana, and we both went through the BA and the MA program in religious studies at Missouri State in Springfield, and then you went on to Princeton Theological Seminary to do your MDiv. I am conscious of the fact that my experience of everything that we have in common and your experience of it are likely very different. And so I'm interested in hearing about that.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just start with sort of how I came to a place where now I would be a person who puts anti-racism educator in a bio. A lot of this is shaped by my time at Princeton. One of the things I think that was really interesting about the difference between my master's at Missouri State and my master's at Princeton, aside from the fact that like Missouri State is a state school and Princeton is a seminary, is that aside from like the conversations about religion, potentially theology in both places, most of the sort of critical social work and thinking that I was doing at Missouri State was largely around gender and questions of like feminism in particular. Not much conversation about race, which is really interesting. Like thinking back, I don't think I took a class where race and issues of race were central to a course. Ethnicity, yes, but not race. And I think that that's an important distinction because in the United States in particular, ethnicity is a very like nebulous category, mostly because you have large groups of people who in one way or another are displaced from their ancestral roots. So ethnicity is like not a category that makes much sense here as much as people would like to try to claim it. Like, you know, people will be like, I'm Irish. I'm like, that doesn't mean, it actually doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, it's purely abstract that like I have an ancestor who came here from Calabria in southern Italy in like the mid 1800s. It's nice for me to think about. It gives me some kind of nice sense of like, oh, studying Mediterranean culture is like, you know, full circle for me. It's not like a lived identity for me, you know?
Right. And so that was just an interesting thing that race was not really part of the calculus there. And I think there are potentially reasons for that. But I think my time sort of coming out of like a very particular way of life and thinking in Joplin, Missouri, and then going to Missouri State and doing this degree in religious studies and finally getting a master's kind of really laid the groundwork for me for when I was at Princeton to be able to do some more like critical work thinking about my own identity. Like you mentioned, as you were kind of sharing my background, my parents are from Ghana. I was born in the United States. And so there's a tension between obviously growing up in the United States. I am a Black person. I'm coded as Black by everyone. But my parents, until very recently, did not identify as Black people. And that's true for many folks who come from Ghana and from other African nations. They don't particularly identify as Black. They identify as Ghanaian. And there are a lot of anti-Black ideas that migrate from the United States and Western countries to Africa that contribute to this sort of distancing of Africans from African Americans. So that means that for most of my life, I was not really doing a lot of self-critical thinking about my own racial identity. But at Princeton, I finally feel like I had some space to do that. I think in part, there is something about just leaving, geographically leaving a space that allows you to see things differently. And I think that was a huge part of it. But then also at Princeton, I think two things were really different. One, professors in general were much more quick and capable of incorporating conversations about race into the classroom and doing some of that work of combining the conversations about race and theology. Then the second piece is that while I was at Princeton, they did a historical audit of the institution's relationship to slavery, and then announced plans for how they were going to respond. We can call it reparations. I would hesitate to call it reparations because of the size and scope of the response. But that was like most of my time in seminary was defined by that, the audit and the response to the audit. And so that just meant that pretty much everything I was doing in the classroom was being sort of leveraged into what does this actually mean in the real world. So if we're talking about, you know, the legacies of slavery and how Christian faith in the United States played a particular role in crafting this institution and its afterlife, how should we respond? And I think as an anti-racism educator, that's sort of my primary interest. The anti-racism education landscape is very broad, and I don't really consider myself like fully invested. Like I'm not trying to build a platform. I'm not trying to like build a brand. The primary things sort of formal workshops and things that I've done. A friend of mine and I, we created a workshop over this last summer during the pandemic, primarily online, sort of geared toward folks who are interested in learning, again, about the intersections of Christian faith and Christian history and race, racism, and anti-racism. And that's the stuff that I think is most interesting and exciting. So I've done that workshop, led it for church folks and for college students. And now in my job as a campus minister, that is something that is not like a formal job description, but it is something that I cannot do my job without incorporating just because of who I am as a person. So in specific ways, that looks like I lead a small group called Faith and Antiracism. This will be the second time that we've done it. And I'm excited to offer it again this fall. And then I also just make it a goal. And luckily, I'm very thankful that my partner in ministry, Erica Liu, the pastor and director at Press House, she's also someone who's very game to do this, is to just incorporate that sort of thinking and connections into our preaching and our conversations with students and the sorts of groups that we try to offer and the sort of songs that we try to sing in worship. Like that, it's just sort of baked into what I do. So that was a lot. I just like talked for a long time and said a lot of things, but I hope that I've addressed the initial question.
Yeah, and you actually touched on, I tend to find, so I've made this joke like 100 times, but I titled this thing A Perennial Digression, and kind of the joke of a perennial digression is that if a digression is going on constantly, it's not really a digression, right? So I end up finding that like all such things kind of just take me where I want to go in terms of questions that I've written. Yeah, so you touched on a few of these things. So I had a question here on, you know, people sometimes hear questions asked in good faith, other times asked very much in bad faith about the difference between like African and African American experiences of racism. You kind of touched on that. I think maybe actually the place to go is, so theologically speaking, as long as I've known you, you've been something of a discontent wherever I've happened to find you, which is I think why we're friends.
Yeah.
How is race handled in the Christian community in which you grew up? How has it been handled in the ones that you have subsequently joined? Like, what's that been like? Because I mean, I remember like, and as far as you're comfortable talking about it, of course, like that's kind of the universal filter. But I mean, I remember being at MSU with you, and I remember like going to, it's going to hurt me to say this, you know, it is Chi Alpha. Change your name, Chi Alpha. You know, I remember going there, and I remember that actually being one of the more like diverse campus ministries on campus, right? Like certainly more diverse than going to like a crew meeting, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, I have lots of friends in crew. I don't mean this as a criticism of them, but like, you know, it's kind of like Christianity for like middle-class white kids who go to college, right? Yeah. For the most part. And so I'm just interested, like, how has your experience of this shifted kind of in the lead up to going to Princeton? Like, what was that formation like?
Yeah, that is, I mean, we could definitely talk about this for a long, long time. So I will start in the tradition that I grew up in. So I grew up in the Assemblies of God. And sort of on the whole, as a denomination, the Assemblies of God is very white, particularly in the United States, as most Christian denominations are. I think what makes the Assemblies of God slightly different than most other standard white conservative Christian traditions in the United States is that it has a very, very mission international focus, which means that while if you look at an Assemblies of God church, you're going to see a lot of white people, particularly if you're looking at an Assemblies of God church in Southwest Missouri, or the church that I went to was actually in Southeast Kansas, but like, you know, we're on the border, so it's like 10 minutes away from my house. The denomination will say, look at us. This denomination is growing. Most of our people live outside of the United States and in the global South and in Africa. So like we're a very diverse denomination. I think that what I will say is, I think that is an example of diversity without actual multiculturalism. And it's very, 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 very easy to replicate whiteness and white theological concerns and ideas in a space where there are not white people. And I think that the Assemblies of God and a lot of other conservative Christian traditions are very good at that. Specifically for me on the ground, race did not exist in my church. So my family was, I'm sure that this is not the case, but this is how I remember it, which I think is just as important, that my family was like the only people of color in the church.
Quick shout out to Victor Matthews and his theory of remembered space.
No matter what, Victor Matthews will always loom as the shadow over all of us.
Yes, he's looking over all that we do. Like, yes, good. Good.
Hopefully. I was always afraid that I would be a massive disappointment to him because, you know, you can never quite tell. But in that space, race didn't exist. I felt like I was the only family of color in our church. And I was very, again, I would say this in hindsight, I was very invested in assimilating. So I did not want to be perceived as different from my friends who were all white, which meant that I did not want to be perceived as a Black person. So that meant trying to dress in particular ways, and mostly it meant trying to not act in particular ways that were anti-Black stereotypes. So like, don't speak in certain ways unless it's funny. Don't dress in certain ways. For a long time, it was like, don't wear my hair a certain way. And when race would come up then, and to some extent still now in conversations that I may or may not be having with those folks from the church that I grew up in, there was a lot of, I don't see you as Black, I just see you as a brother in Christ, or I just see you as me. Very, like a very standard kind of colorblind response. when I went to Missouri State, it was very interesting to be in Chi Alpha. Again, I would agree with you that is one of the more diverse campus communities at Missouri State. And it's also not very diverse. So it's unique in that, and still to this day, Chi Alpha's lead pastor is Andy Estrella, who's a Dominican man. I still consider him one of my great friends and mentors. And so like that was the first time I, and probably most people there, had a person of color as their pastor. And there were also like other Black folks and other folks of color in the community. Again, there, I would say race was not a conversation we were having. I would say what was missing was the sort of colorblind rhetoric. So like growing up, people would specifically address my racial identity and say, I don't see it. Whereas in Chi Alpha, it was just a thing that didn't really come up at all. And for the first sort of chunk of my time in college, that was fine with me. Again, because I was in a space where I hadn't really done any sort of critical self-thinking on this at all. I think, oh Lord, and now my brain is getting jumbled on dates. Between when Trayvon Martin was killed and when Michael Brown was killed. I think Trayvon Martin was killed first, but I've only been awake for 33 minutes, so it's hard to say. But that, I think, caused a real shift on campus, and a shift for me. There were also some more personal things going on that sort of forced me to, for the first time, realize like, oh, I walk into a room and people see me as a Black person. And for most of my life, I was under the impression, as I think a lot of folks who grow up in situations, in environments like I did, that if I just excel at everything, then no one will code me as a Black person, which is a lie. It's a flat out lie. It's always going to happen, no matter how good you are at anything. And so I started to chafe, mostly because I saw my community in Chi Alpha as a place where I would go to get language for meaning. And that community did not have the language for that sort of chafing. I didn't know what to do with it. And what's interesting is that I was also chafing spiritually at the same time. Like my first sort of mind explosion class, I took Dr. Bain's course on Jesus I took it my sophomore year. I took 18 credits and all of them were upper level classes. I don't know why I did this, but it was such a stupid decision because I was like exposed to historical criticism for the first time. And it's like aimed at Jesus. And I was like, why are you attacking my savior? So again, there, it was like, I'm having this crisis of question and meaning, and I'm hoping to find language for it in my Christian community, and there's not language for it there. So I was definitely chafing against there not being space to really have that conversation when I was in Chi Alpha. But I think what ended up happening is that in my mind, I chose to resolve the spiritual crisis first and deal with the questions of race and identity second. Mm-hmm. So I think I have, now that I have some time and distance, I think it's easier for me to see the ways that Chi Alpha was not a place that I think was able to really nurture that and like kind of keep me safe, which I think is important. But at the time, I was just sort of like, I don't really know what to do with this. And I'm just going to deal with it later, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I can see how, I mean, I'm thinking of, for me, probably my bigger paradigm shifts in college kind of happening simultaneous to all of this on these questions. So, you know, I met you and your brother like right away. I actually met your brother as a junior in high school
Of course,
touring Missouri State. Yeah.
Everyone meets my brother at some point.
Yeah.
And I've literally been in Washington, D.C., walking down the street and met someone who knows my brother. It's just, it's an absurdity.
I laughed out loud. I literally stopped what I was doing and had to guffaw when I was like just kind of walking on campus sometime after graduation, just kind of revisiting everything. And I literally said to Beth, I think I was walking with Bethany, and I was like, I'm just really surprised there's not like a bronze statue of Nipapo somewhere here, because he's basically the mascot of the school. And she just points, and I look off to the left, and there's this huge banner on a building of me just standing there, like looking over the campus. And I was like, oh my God, they did it.
They had to. They absolutely had to.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, my first semester of college, I meet the two of you guys. I become friends with you, right? I spend about a year in the Episcopal Church, and then I become a catechumen over at Unexpected Joy, where Father Moses was the priest, right? And so I felt really blessed that, like, you know, people I was looking up to at the time were people of color who were, you know, I would say filling in the progressivism that I came to college with like actual, like, I don't know, experience or knowledge of, like, you know, hey, like, this is not just something I've imbibed from the culture, right? Mm-hmm. But I experienced, I think, some of what you're talking about in terms of, like, you know, diversity of color and diversity of culture being distinct things, right? And I've definitely experienced, like, since college, I mean, in Orthodoxy and Catholicism, you know, in these communities, there's a way of kind of tokenizing the number of, like, ethnicities that you have in the room, right? So, like, when I go to the Basilica, and I look around and I see, like, oh, there are African, like, priests and monks, and oh, there are, like, you know, Asian nuns, and there are all these different people of color who come to the cathedral. Surely Catholicism is very diverse, right? Until you, like, look on the wall and all of the icons are like white people, right? Like, it's white biblical characters, right? And yeah, I mean, I think that I didn't experience this, like, I didn't have the experience that you did where I had to figure this out because it was, like, you know, my actual existence
right.
that was sort of on the table. But then I feel like, and to kind of move into where our, like, historical, critical, and theological work has, I think, most intersected on, like, Paul, right? Mm-hmm. Shout out to Mark Given, who somewhere I hope is just having really good vibes right now.
Yeah.
But, you know, like, as I got into Pauline studies, and as I, like, gradually shifted from kind of new perspective on Paul, right, where Paul is basically like, oh yeah, he's, like, defined by Jewish context, whatever that means, but he's not, like, he doesn't think of himself as a Jew anymore, into, like, radical new perspective thinking of, like, no, like, Paul's very ethnically conscious, right? Mm-hmm. Like, actually his entire theology depends on, like, a very traditional Jewish notion of the distinction between Israel and the nations that's been, like, apocalyptically overcome in Christ, but that still remains very relevant to their, like, relations in the world and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Coming into that was very important for me, because I feel like it was the first inkling that I had that these issues of ethnicity or of race, and I realize those are not the same thing, that they have, like, theological consequence, I guess. So I'm wondering how, because you did your whole thesis on Paul, so I'm wondering, like, if Paul shaped you in thinking about this at all.
Yeah, I think yes, and now less so. And I think I think I'm grateful for that step in the journey. So my master's thesis was on a passage from 2 Corinthians, the very well-known, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And so I spent a lot of time engaging with that passage from an anthropological perspective and trying to trace, what does Paul think about bodies, what bodies are made of, what keeps a body intact, and what can threaten a body. and sort of trying to trace that theme throughout the letter, and then how does it play out in the implications of this particular passage. So I was like somewhat adjacent to a lot of the sort of standard places that people will go when they want to talk about Paul and ethnicity or Paul and race. Like most common is probably Galatians. Then you're probably going to dip into like Ephesians and Colossians, some stuff in Romans, and then Philemon, because that's talking about slavery. Like those are the places that people really like to go. And so I was like kind of adjacent, but less so in my formal sort of research. I will say, while I was a master's student, I, like you, was sort of moving from this, new perspective, which I'm going to just say this. I don't know if I believe it, but it's a thought that just came to my mind. I think the new perspective is rather assimilationist from a ethnic and racial perspective, which is enough for me to say I'm not down for this. To sort of a radical Paul. So I was like down with this. Oh, Paul is really interested in not erasing these differences, but how do we create communities and hold them together amidst difference, honor difference, respect difference, and hold each other up when our differences cause conflict. So I was like, yeah, that's like, I'm down for this. Like, we can do this. And in my mind at the time, what that looked like was a church that's just like full of different like races and ethnicities, and somehow everybody is like represented well and feels at home. I would say now I am much more skeptical of that possibility actually playing out in the real world. I think for a few reasons. One, I think the fact that Paul has so many letters where he is trying to address this issue suggests that it's not a simple solution. And the way that, for example, Galatians 3 will just sort of be held up, like, we are all one in Christ. Yay. I'm like, if it was that easy, why are there conflicts between the strong and the weak in Corinth? Why are there conflicts between the strong and the weak in Rome? Why is Onesimus being mistreated by his master? Like all of this is sort of clearly not working out according to plan. So that's one. Second, on a more sort of contemporary ground movement, there in the United States, and I will say it's mostly been studied from the perspective of like evangelicalism. So perhaps that there might be more opportunities for this in other sort of traditions. I'm hesitant to say that that's likely, but there was a large movement of multicultural churches or multiracial churches. And typically in the field, a multiracial church is defined by, oh gosh, I'm going to get the definition wrong. I think it's like no one group. It's like no one group has above a certain percentage in the congregation. The bar is rather low, so you might think a multiracial church is like, oh, like 30% white and 30% African American and 30% Asian and 10% something else, and it's typically more like 70% white, 20% African American, 10% everything else. So that's one thing. And a lot of work has been done. There's a great book on this called The Elusive Dream that basically just says, these are white churches with people of color in them. And the only way people of color stay in the church is by giving in to the concerns of whiteness.
Because the issue is fundamentally structural.
Yes.
Right? Because I'm thinking about this, like, so in ancient perspective, right? These assemblies, these Christ assemblies, they go from being basically like domestic banquets, right? Ritual domestic banquets where people are, they're doing their Eucharists and they're doing their prophesying and their whatever in people's homes. and institutionally and socially, they have other primary sources of worship. At least the Jewish members of these communities do, right? And probably several of the Gentile members are like God-fearers in local synagogues and things like that. But other institutions exist that perform the functions that we look to churches to perform today. And like the Eucharistic Assembly is something both much different and much deeper and much, and for that reason also, like, it's not functioning as like a, it's not functioning in the same way, basically. You go forward a few centuries, you go into the 2nd century, you go into the 3rd century, as you know, Christianity shifts to being a demographically Gentile majority, A, and then B, starts talking about itself as a tertium genus, right? A third nation between Judaism and Hellenism, and starts conceiving of itself as an assimilationist identity. And then it gets imperial power to be able to do that. And like a lot of things start shifting, where people are no longer meeting in homes. People are meeting in public buildings designed for a Eucharist that has been reduced from like a banquet to like a sacramental thing you do on a Sunday morning, right? For anyone watching this who's interested, go read Andrew McGowan. But like, you know, that in and of itself, I think, forces the dynamic that you're talking about, because we still basically have that model of church as like church is a public institution. It's a public institution that is supposed to represent and reiterate like social identities in various ways. And so, yeah, like it's intrinsically competitive on those grounds, right? Would you like, what would you add to that or qualify about it?
Yeah, I would just say it makes the dream really hard. And to some extent, I think that, again, this is a hot take, I'm going to say it, don't know how committed I am to it. I think on the whole, Christianity, and I'll narrow it to the United States, is still sort of motivated as we're sort of entering into this new wave of racial reckoning. I use quotes because I hate the term racial reckoning, but it's very accessible to people. This conversation, particularly among Christians, is motivated by like, how do we get to the passage in Revelation where every tribe and nation and tongue is like gathered, and it's like it's like a rainbow of colors of people. Like, how do we get there? And to my mind, from like a sort of, I don't know, more standard academic perspective, like that's an apocalyptic vision. It is not meant to map onto reality in a one-to-one way. So
I was thinking as you were saying that, well, Revelation's answer is we have an apocalyptic cataclysm that ends
right, like, do you want the sky to roll up like a blanket? Is that, because that's what it's going to take if you're trying to map on one-to-one to get there. But that's still the dream. There's a quote from an author named Brian Bantam that I love so much, and I'm gonna pull it up on my phone. I have it saved because I literally use it so often. But it's about this very question. So let me find it. So this is in his book, The Death of Race. It's a very beautiful, poetic book. And he says, too often the language of reconciliation presupposes a relationship, that we somehow know what the end of this process looks like, that at the end, I have to sit at the table of fellowship. This is not freedom, but another form of coercion. Too many reconciliation conversations funded by white churches do not risk the possibility that dark bodies do not want to be with them, that what non-white Christians really want is a life where their wholeness is presupposed. And so for me, I am very interested in what it would look like for Christians in the United States to adopt that sort of vision, as opposed to the Revelation, everybody in the same room type of vision. Because the Revelation, everybody in the room type of vision, like, who is that for? That's sort of my primary question. If you ask, again, I don't want to like speak for everyone, but if you ask me, if you ask many other Christians of color, they're not like clamoring to be in the room with white people on Sundays. That's not like a goal. What they want is to live in a world without police brutality, to live in a world without mass incarceration, to live in a world where they have enough food to eat and money to get their kids to school and provide them healthcare. Like, those are the things that are concerning, not being in a church with white people on Sundays. So this revelation sort of vision, to me, is primarily a concern of like white folks who are interested in kind of assuaging and erasing their racial guilt, which is not particularly entertaining to me. So on the whole, and this is sort of why now I'm kind of like, I don't really know what to do with Paul, is that Paul is, I think, very good at providing a logic for holding groups together. But I think what is also true of Paul is like, when he can't get there nicely, he just sort of brute forces it. So, I mean, you see this like in 2 Corinthians, in the beginning, he's like, oh, we broke for you, we wept for you, we will sacrifice our bodies for you. And in the end, he's like, I'm coming to you in power and I will beat the hell out of anyone who tries to get in my way.
And just imagine Paul walking in with like force powers, you know, just like throwing someone against the wall or whatever. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, some
minimally, that's what Paul thinks he can do, right?
Yes.
Like whatever, like whoever's watching this, whatever you think about that, fine. But just like, no, that's what Paul thinks he's capable of. Okay.
Paul thinks he is a Jedi.
Yeah.
But I think that there is something instructive in the fact that like, that's the sort of fail-safe built into that mechanism, is like, if we can't get it to work, we'll just force it in. And so I'm hesitant to lean too much on Paul. Two more thoughts just sort of came into my head that sort of make this relationship complicated. One, there's a great anecdote I love. It actually comes from Princeton's historical audit on slavery, because it was a person who attended Princeton who grew up as the child of a plantation owner and then went to Princeton, got his theological education, became very invested in evangelizing enslaved people, and so went back to his home in Georgia to basically preach to enslaved people for the rest of his life. One day he gets up, gathers the slaves, starts to preach on Philemon and talk about, being, treating your slaves well and this sort of stuff. And it says half of the people there just left. They just got up and left. And the other half were like, hey, that's not in the Bible. Keeping in mind that these are people who they don't know, because they can't, most of them can't read in this particular setting. They don't know, but they're just like, that's not in the Bible. That's not scripture. So I think that for a long time, and this is still true, there's been a big resistance to and suspicion of Paul because of these logics of assimilation and submission that are sort of baked into all of the letters. On the other side, there's a really rich history and tradition of African-American interpretations of Paul that seek to grapple with that logic and sometimes overcome it or subvert it or incorporate it, whatever, which is just to say that Black people feel all kinds of ways about Paul. And so it's one thing for me to say, I am not sure that Paul is going to be the gateway to freedom, but there are others who would disagree. And I actually had these conversations in seminary. I'm like, I'm not sure about Paul. And they're like, I am. So it's complex.
Well, and I think the common scriptural vision that's motivating everything that Paul's doing and that's motivating St. John of Patmos, I actually think that John Bear is probably right, and that John of Patmos is just John the Elder. But anyway, the common vision motivating both of them, right, is this vision in the prophets that God's going to do two things with the nations, basically. He's first going to reckon with them, right, for the ways that they've mistreated Israel primarily, and also with their gods, because gods and their peoples are inseparable in ancient consciousness, right? But then, kind of after all that happens, the nations and their gods come to worship God in Zion, right? And so Paul thinks he's like making that happen is the thing. Like we misunderstand Paul when we miss that, right? Like Paul thinks that by going on these missions and then returning to Jerusalem and like bringing back these collections to the Jerusalem community and all this stuff, like he's getting everything ready so that when like Christ comes, all the nations will just like flock there. And he's convinced, like, I've done it. Like, everyone's heard, everyone knows now, we're all ready. And it's the same thing in the apocalypse, right? Like that's what they're talking about. And I think remembering that that's eschatology, right? It is at best sort of it is at best foreshadowed, and in the best Christian communities, maybe it is to some extent like partially realized, but it's by no means an ideal that we can realistically, like, I think you're absolutely right. We can't realistically hold every single community to that standard, because I mean, especially in our context where it's like, look, I mean, most Christian churches are not like functioning well in the majority of ways anyway. So expecting them, expecting contemporary communities to also do race well is like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs should have racial reconciliation and harmony as a foundational core tenet. And yet in the experience of many of these communities, that's not there, right?
Yeah.
Like many of them are kind of treading water and drowning. I guess like this kind of leads into, actually, let's just like, if you're cool with it, let's just get into, you've got this fantastic Google Doc of resources on how to become anti-racist for interested white people who perhaps don't know what they should do, and perhaps may or may not be of goodwill. One of the first things you note on that resource is that like white people should not ask Black and Indigenous people of color folks to explain racism to us. So first, I'm sorry if I'm breaking your first rule by having this here. But second, I agree with this, and I'm wondering, like, how can white people be better educators to other white people about race? Like, how can white people not just sort of childishly like look at people of color and be like, tell me what to do,
Yeah. So I will say one thing. So first, I endorse that Google Doc, but I did not create it.
Okay. My misunderstanding.
No, and it actually is a good example of the dynamic we're trying to discuss. So that Google Doc was created early pandemic times by three of my friends at seminary: Nikki Zimmerman, Anna Stamborski, and Bailey Gregory. And it would have been very easy for them to be like, hey, what do you think we should put in XYZ category? But they just sort of like did the research and worked to understand. And then really all they asked me was like, hey, can we include this? Like at the time I had come up with a sort of checklist of questions about racial solidarity and allyship. And they asked if they could include that in the Google Doc. And I said, yes. That was like the extent of my guidance, I suppose. This is an excellent question. I think I'll speak for myself personally and then sort of more generally. Most days, if I have a relationship with someone and I can tell that they're genuinely willing to listen and learn, I will have a conversation with them about questions of race and racism. What I think a lot of white folks miss is that those conversations, even if they're with someone I love, are not energizing. They always require a certain amount of emotional labor, particularly if it intersects with points of pain on my story and life. So that's always going to be draining. And I think what sometimes people miss is like, it's very easy for a white person to approach questions of race as like an academic or like sort of self-actualization question. So it's like, oh, me talking to you is the same as me reading a book. But it's like the book is an inanimate object and it's not going to like need to go lay down after you read it, whereas I might. So that's sort of part one. It's like I'll have those conversations, but they are tiring. And so sometimes that just means I can't today. And so being able to be a person who can say, okay, that's fine, I'm not going to impose on you is important. When we get more general and it becomes a question of like, how can white folks become more educated and be better educators of white people? You will find so many different perspectives on this issue. And it's actually one of the things that I find kind of frustrating in this moment is that we've kind of collapsed, like the expectations have kind of collapsed into where it's not entirely clear what makes sense. So you'll have some folks who say, white folks, you need to do the work and you need to be calling your other white friends in, which sometimes I agree. And yes, sometimes I'll be like scrolling Facebook, you know, and I'll see a white person, very well-intentioned, trying to call in another white person, but saying things I'm like, that's not right. You have misunderstood this concept. You are unintentionally like using racist ideas to support your argument. And so there is a sort of unchecked realm of white folks talking to other white folks. And honestly, at this point, I'm just sort of like, that is going to be what it is. Because at the end of the day, until the sky rolls up and we do get that apocalyptic moment, white folks are going to continue to do white folk things. And I can't invest my time in like trying to control that. So what I will say is two things. One, if the primary interest is like engaging in conversation with other people, take the time to find the best resources. Right now, that the market is flooded with books about everything, particularly in this sort of new anti-racism literature field. And some of the resources there are fantastic. Some I would personally not recommend, but I understand why others would read them. And some are just bad. And so the first step is not buying a book. I'd say the first step is like figuring out who are the voices that I should listen to. And in that sort of calculus, I would say Black women, top of the list. If you can, read a book by a Black woman over a Black man every time, because incorporating that analysis of gender is going to be important. I would say the same thing for like Black queer folks, because again, incorporating that analysis of gender and sexuality is something that a lot of Black men miss when they write these books. The second thing that I would say, aside from taking the time to figure out what to read, is how to say this? It's okay to go slow. I think there is, Martin Luther King has this phrase, the fierce urgency of now. And there is a very, I think it's faded actually a fierce urgency to sort of know the things, to get things right so that we can have the conversation with our racist uncle because he keeps saying racist things. For me, I think the racist uncle is not the primary problem. And so to some extent, if what a person is most interested in is like having that conversation with their uncle, then they need to take time, because that's gonna take so long. And truly, like, trying to educate someone on race who is resistant to fundamental ideas about race and racism, or is just like very new, it takes so long and it takes so much effort. And it's never going to be as simple as like, we had this one conversation and it changed my life, because that's just like not how life works in general.
Right.
So it requires a lot of patience that I think, as with most social movements, people who sort of are awakened to the social movement by the catalyzing incident don't have. Because they think, oh, if I jump in now, 6 weeks later, it'll be good, which is not true. This is very much a lifelong engagement. And so if it's something that you want to do, cool, but like you're in it. And like it might take a year or two before you are actually really capable of educating another human being. And that's fine, because you're not the only one doing the work, which is the other thing.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
But I have another question first that I think kind of leads into it. So the resource we're talking about also talks about white guilt or shame, which I think is an interesting topic. So on the one hand, it's not the job of Black and Indigenous people of color to like resolve white guilt or white shame for white people. I'm thinking of, so my wife and I have been watching Blackish for like the last few months, basically because we cycle through sitcoms to live, right? But Blackish had like a bunch of great reviews, and we had watched Fresh Off the Boat earlier in the year, and so I was like, yes, like let's do it, because I've heard about this forever, and it's great. Like it's a fantastic show. It provides fantastic education and treatment of concepts and whatever. One of the things that I noticed about it that I think is interesting is that there's like not a single good white person on the show, right? And Blackish is not interested in giving me that, right?
Yeah.
Like Blackish is not interested in telling me like there's a way to be a good white person. The closest that you get in the whole show is that the main character's wife has a cousin who's white, who comes to dinner one day, and like the white family and the Black family get into a conversation about like race, and then it gets around to him, and he says, you know, I think Black people are better, and I don't understand why you don't all just rise up and destroy us. And it's like that's the best that show is like kind of preaching at me explicitly, right? Like I recognize that implicitly way more is going on there.
Yeah.
But I'm interested on the other hand, because like I've written on this recently, that, you know, kind of both ways, race is almost like entrapment within flesh, in the way that flesh is socially and cosmically described and defined, right? So I'm thinking Paul here, right? Like flesh is something that is hopelessly conditioned by sin and that is socially constructed in all these different ways, both in ways that are like pleasant to experience and in ways that are unpleasant to experience. And to be honest, like when I contemplate what was done to like a tiny portion of my ancestors by the greater portion of my ancestors, and then when I contemplate like what most of my ancestors ended up doing to other people, I get really depressed, right? Like I feel conned by the fact that some of my ancestry was not considered white when it got here, and it's been assimilated, right? And I have no choice about it. Like I have no, like it just is true, whether I want it to be or not, that like I'm part of white culture, right? That like that's how I read to other people, that I'm the beneficiary of systems of oppression, that like no amount of thinking about this and no amount of having the right ideas changes any of that, right?
Yeah.
It is really depressing, and it raises real questions about like, is it possible to be a good white person, right? So I'm not asking you to resolve my existential dilemma, but my question is, how do you motivate people in process to becoming anti-racist beyond this kind of like nihilistic crossroads of things, right? Because like I think on the one hand, it's totally correct, like people shouldn't just settle down there. But I think on the other hand, like it is a real like primal scream in the face of like, oh wow, like I can't escape it, you know, like there is this evil that has like conditioned my whole life without me even realizing it until now. So like, how do we like push people beyond that?
Yeah. The way you actually phrased that question the first time was like, how do we motivate people to do this? And my first thought was like, I never want to motivate anyone to do anything. That sounds like a horrible way to spend my time. But I do think that is actually probably what I would say, is that I don't know that it is possible to push someone past that stage. I think that there's a lot going on spiritually and internally that gets resolved spiritually and internally. And typically, folks who can resolve that and get past it are folks who actually have relationships with people of color.
Hmm.
I think part of the reason why we have this sort of loud, screaming mass of people now who are like, I don't understand why you're trying to say that I am responsible for racism. I wasn't alive. I didn't do it. I didn't own slaves. You can't take my money and pay reparations. And it just like sort of escalates from there.
Mhm.
Like those people, most of the time, the only time they're encountering people of color is on TV or on the internet. And so there is no one in their life whose presence and lived experience can force them to integrate that fear.
Mhm.
And I think that's true for like a lot of moments of crisis. Like often, it's particularly when it's questions around like identity and social things, like we resolve them because we have to, because there's a person sitting across the table from us that we have to figure out how to engage with.
Mhm.
So for me, the times that I have seen folks kind of get out of that stage has been not through conversations that I've had with them, in part because I hate talking to people in that stage personally. There are some people who are built for that work. I am not. It drives me insane. I just really want to like give them a, but it's just been through me doing my thing and them being forced to either come on board or not. So that on a more grand social scale is rather depressing because that means probably most people, at least in the near future, are going to be stuck in that phase. But I will say that is okay with me if my life is safer.
Mhm.
Like if they're sad, but like the United States passes a bill for reparations,
Mhm.
I'm like, cry away, cry all. I will buy you tissues myself.
Mhm.
I don't care because we've made progress in this other area.
With reparations money. you get your check and you're just like, oh, here you go, white people. Here's some tissues, you know.
Well, that's a whole other thing is whether I would get a check for reparations, but that's like that could be its whole.
Right. I remember you talking to me about this once, how there's complicated politics around that.
Yeah, it's
no, and I, you know, I think part of it has to be that you know, I think white people who get stuck in that stage, one of the things, I don't think it's the only thing that's going on, but I think one of the things is that, you know, American culture really trains white people to think that they're all capable of becoming superheroes and billionaires. Yes. And you know, that every single one of them is just like wildly important. And there's a theological way of constructing the human person that like tells everybody that, right? Like, and that's legitimate as far as it goes. But that theological way of doing that is also married to this idea that we are like dirt. That we are dust, and to dust we shall return, and all of this stuff. And so it's married to a kind of, you know, repentance and mourning, in a sense of real mourning for our fallen condition, which I increasingly think for the authors of the New Testament and the earliest fathers of the church, that fallen condition is actually like our fleshed existence itself. But anyway, the like, so I think part of the answer to that has got to be, and I'm wondering what you think of this, that like we have to push white people past the threshold of there will be a point where I'm a good white person, right? maybe, I don't know. Like, I don't actually know if that's possible, but also like penitents don't ask that question,
Right.
right? Like if I go to confession, I'm not looking to walk out of the confessional thinking like, man, I'm awesome. You know, like I'm so good. Like I walk out of the confessional like praising God for his infinite mercy that he doesn't just like annihilate me right now, right? And so I wonder if part of the issue is just that like American culture has very little concept of repentance for the most part. That's like meaningful, I guess.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I actually, and I'm glad that the book is sitting right next to me. So I just finished this book. It's called "We Do This Till We Free Us: Abolitionists Organizing and Transforming Justice." It's by Mariam Kaba, who's a longtime abolitionist organizer. And by abolition, I mean specifically around police, prisons, surveillance, and the criminal, as she would call it, the criminal. That's I'm going to get the term wrong. What we would say the criminal justice system. She has another term that she uses for it. And one of the things she talks about in the book is she does a lot of accountability and healing processes around like mostly around issues of sexual violence within local communities. And I sort of see that the process that she describes as an analogous one for like folks kind of dealing with incidents of racial harm that they might have perpetrated or just like grappling with their complicity in racism structurally. And one of the things she says is like, a lot of people assume that like entering into this process, you come out on the other side and you're like healed and better. And that's what she thought when she started the work. But she's realized over time that most of the time people enter the process and it's like, I have to just be able to live.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not at a place where I'm going to be able to be healed or whole or integrated, but like I need to be able to function. Mm-hmm. And I think that is more important. Like whether or not Joe Schmo becomes, this very well and enlightened white person, like sure, that's great. But what I think is more important is like, can you function in relationships with people of color and not cause them harm? Can you function in your workplace and not be an agent of white supremacy? If that happens, sweet, I'm great. And then sure, maybe by the time you're 60, you will like be a good white person. It's sort of the nebulous question of like, what does it mean to be good? Mm-hmm. And whether that actually matters in any real sense. I do not think that theologically being good is the primary goal. And I don't think that that is true from a sort of base human social calculation either.
Yeah. Well, and does personal sanctity or personal moral goodness absolve us of corporate identities and the culpabilities that come with those? And I don't think so. Right.
Right.
I mean, you read the hagiography of nearly any saint, you know, from years of talking to me how much I love C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and the Inklings. And I do. They exercise a profound influence on my thinking, on my aesthetic preferences, on just a lot. And I think that they were all very good and holy men. And they were also very much defined by the cultural assumptions and complicities of mid-20th century, like Britain kind of just sort of starting to dismantle the British Empire.
Right.
And they were of an age and they were of a generation where it was really difficult for them to see how that was a good thing. Yeah. Right. And so there's some sense too here where I think like maybe part of the answer, and I realize that like it's a question that requires an answer that is more pressing for me than for you, right? But it's like maybe part of the answer to that question is just to emphasize that like, look, I mean, repenting of a giant cultural force like this, that someone like Paul himself would have definitely identified as like, oh yeah, there's some like demon or God behind that you're
right, for sure.
that you're like warring against, and like you're probably not going to do it on your own, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, like laboring to repent of that and laboring to do meaningful repentance of that. is, I mean, like that can coexist with the idea that like, look, like you're a person who loves justice and walks humbly, you know, and loves mercy, and like you may never totally finish, but like if you make progress, that matters, right?
Yeah.
Like that's something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely don't want to give the impression that like that sort of personal sort of heart or soul work doesn't matter. I've actually spent the better part of the last 3 days trying to wrestle a sermon out of Mark chapter 7, where Jesus has this encounter with the Pharisees about hand washing. And he's like, it's not, the thing that I've been wrestling with is the part where he says, nothing on the outside can defile. It is only the things that come from within that can defile. And I'm like, really? You had to say nothing? Like, ugh, that makes this really hard to preach. But there is this very obvious, real concern from Jesus that like, actually, no, like your heart does matter. Like if you're a person whose heart produces murder, avarice, licentiousness, in the case of our conversation, racism, that's an issue and you should address it. I think the challenge, and again, this is sort of where we have to do more creative work theologically, is if everyone is just like repented in their heart, there are a lot of laws that still will cause people to have disproportionate outcomes. And like, if every police officer is a Christian, the police officer still is given the power by the state through a various means, legal and court rulings and all this stuff, to shoot me if I don't comply. And whether or not that officer has in their heart a racist intention, their job is shaped in such a way to take my life and the lives of people like me at a higher rate than those who don't. And so I don't want to say one matters more than the other, but I also want to say one matters more than the other. And it's typically the one that's not about you as an individual person, whoever you are watching this.
Yes. Joe, white person, and statistically their name is probably Joe. So, okay, I have more questions. Before I get into, I have a lot of questions actually about how we represent this in pop culture, and this is my throwing the Marvel bone to you, which is actually throwing the Marvel bone to me. But before I get there, I mentioned this idea, and you mentioned this idea of, you know, white people sometimes have a habit of moving into anti-racist work and sort of like, they try to assume like a heroic mantle, right? They're like, oh, I am destroying white supremacy, right? Or like whatever. You know, I mean, white people have a habit of trying to take over the situation when they walk into a room. There's always something weird to me about the notion of a white person like leading a Black Lives Matter protest, or of a white person being on a diversity and inclusion committee, like in a leadership role. Not because white people shouldn't be involved, they should be, but because it seems to miss the point for like white voices to be platformed in those contexts, right? Like, I remember someone close to me that I won't name for safety purposes was asked to be on a diversity and inclusion panel for the place they worked at, and it was all white people on the diversity and inclusion panel. And that person very like clearly said, I don't think I should be on this panel because it seems like you have other problems to address. You know? And so like, as white people do move, however they move, from like white guilt and shame to participation in anti-racist resistance, like what level of participation is appropriate? Like, is there a threshold? Is there a limitation to what kinds of things white people can do here? Everything from like, do white people get to be in the room where it happens and like strategizing about resistance? Do white people get to create culture, like popular culture, or like books, or, you know, whatever, that highlight diversity and people of color and that like assist in that? Or are those precisely the kinds of things that like, look, it is just the nature of the situation that like white people need to be stepping aside for that. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Such a good question. I think about this so much. It might feel like a cop out, but I really, really want to say that it depends. It depends so much on place and context and what's possible within the existing power structures of an institution. Like there are some places where you might be really well intentioned. You're like, you know, we're doing this diversity. We like we have this diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. We want more people of color, and like the place that you're living is like 96% white. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of clamoring to be like, oh, we can't move forward until we meet XYZ benchmarks of diversity. That actually doesn't make sense in that situation, because as your friend said, there's like deeper issues there that can't be addressed by simply platforming a person of color or deplatforming a white person. And that kind of work is like deep, structural, and often requires a radical transformation of institutions that's incredibly challenging to do in the sort of time frame that most institutions are interested in. Mm-hmm. So I want to say, this is what I want to say. I want to say, yes, get out of the way and just let people of color do all of the things. But I think what that misses is the fact that the real work is not at the surface level, where like there is a Black person CEO or a, you know, Hispanic woman directing this film, or the chair of the department is an Asian woman. That's like the very tip of the iceberg, and the rest of the work is underneath. And the work that's underneath often requires a bunch of white people to be involved, because like, who's going to make the decisions about how to fundamentally change the university? The board, and the board is white people, and you can't swap them out because that's not how boards work. In the end, at the end of a process, you might have an institution that has a very different kind of board, or no board. I don't know how these things work, but like, you can't get there without white people making a bunch of decisions, mm-hmm. which is sort of the issue. And that's why these problems are so intractable. So I will say it is complicated. And if you are a white person who's like wrestling with this in a very particular context, I would always say, talk to the people, to the Black, Indigenous, other people of color in that space, listen, and go from there. Mm-hmm. Because it's going to look different in every case. Mm-hmm. And I don't like that I just said that, because I'm someone who really likes rule books and like guidelines and frameworks, but
it's just so much nicer when you can essentialize something, right?
Right.
Like we never can, but like it's so much easier to. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think this applies like across the board to all kinds of things. So I'm thinking about how, like, on the one hand, right, Marvel does a great job of hiring people of color and Asian people and people who are like actually being represented in the different franchises that they're adapting for film, mm-hmm. to write and direct and produce. And, you know, I mean, like Black Panther is a fantastic example, right, with Ryan Coogler and his whole team. And at the same time, Kevin Feige is the white dude that orchestrates all of that, right? Like, he's the guy who sits at the Disney board. He's the guy who sits at the table with like Bob Iger, or whoever's running Disney right now, is like, no, like, I'm going to hire you know, Chloe, I think it's like Chloe Zhao or whoever made Eternals that's coming out in November. I'm going to hire her. She's going to make the movie. And like, it's going to be mostly like, it's going to be a bunch of not white people in the movie. Because like, that's what people want. And when I bring you a hoard of money from this, like I always do, you know, you'll be quiet and let me do my thing. Right. So by the way, brief digression. I think it's, this is part of my answer actually. So as I'm sure you know, there's been this whole Martin Scorsese thing with Marvel for the last like couple of years, right? Where Scorsese's complaint is that Marvel is not like real cinema. There are lots of aspects to that, but I do think one of the things here is that like Scorsese tends to make films about white people doing things that like rich white people fantasize about doing, namely like being criminals, right?
Say yes. Holding guns, shooting people, and having lots of money.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's what rich white people fantasize about. And so like that, those are the kinds of movies that Scorsese makes. And so that's what he thinks people should be interested in. I find it interesting that Marvel is so popular with people of color, in part precisely because like it is literally telling myths about like myths in the academic sense, right? About like people of color finding empowerment and like becoming superheroes or, you know, whatever. And of course, it's like up to every individual and community to make a decision about whether or not they think like a movie does that successfully, right? I'm thinking of like, on the one hand, I went and saw like In the Heights this summer, and I thought it was great, right? And then like I totally understood when in the aftermath of that, like large portions of the Hispanic community that you know also tend to have African ancestry were like, you know, down with Lin-Manuel Miranda because there weren't enough of us in the movie. And it's like, oh yeah, like that makes sense. I'm just a white guy, so like I'm going and I'm seeing, you know, hey, like here's some Hispanic people who are entertaining me with music. This is nice. But like if you're going in there and you're seeing something that represents you or that is supposed to represent you, there's like you can be a lot judgier about it, right? Like you can, and you should be, like you should always be judgy about how you're being represented publicly. Anyway, that's my digression on that. Do you have any thoughts on that dynamic?
I do. You know, racism is one thing, capitalism is another. They both exist. Well, one, they could not exist without the other. But when you like really explicitly combine them, it just gets so messy. And Marvel, the MCU, is like a great example of this because, you know, as you were describing, like I'm gonna hire Ryan Coogler, I'm gonna hire Chloe Zhao. It's like those people will push against the sort of standard white narratives and white gaze to an extent, but they also arrived at a certain level of success moving and existing within a framework of filmmaking in Hollywood that is defined by whiteness. And so no matter how much you like want to say this person is like breaking out, that's actually not possible because they are directing a multi-million-dollar film. You can't like you can't have a radical politic inserted into a multi-million-dollar film made by Disney. It's not possible because that would actually undermine everything that Disney is about. Right. And we saw this perfectly with The Winter Soldier. Good God. If there's ever been a show that encapsulates this dynamic, where the first 5 episodes, you're like, wow, is Disney really doing a sustained examination of violence and white nationalism and the role of America in foreign conflicts? No, they're not. Because what happens in episode 6? We just give the black man a shield, paint him in red, white, and blue, kill the terrorists, and the white guy gets off scot-free. Yeah. Because Disney's imagination and capacity for imagination is limited by its money. So,
and it's particularly disappointing because I feel like I feel like in the comics, like Marvel comics themselves are much freer to be like completely deconstructive and radical and prophetic about these kinds of things. And it's probably telling that like when these things are adapted for film or TV, the comic book authors don't actually get paid very much, right? For as much as I love the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I really do, like it keeps me going in a lot of ways, right? It is a sustained, and like this is maybe one of the sicknesses of our culture, is that like the only way that we can be really immersed in narratives that like spark our imagination and like, you know, theologically, mythically, like personally, whatever, is through capitalism. It's like, on the one hand, yeah, like I could boycott Disney, right? Like I could be super principled and just be like, I'm not going to go see any of these movies. But then like I would also then be saying, and I'm not going to have any imaginative culture other than white gangsters stealing and killing, right? And that is kind of the choice that we have. And I think it's that limitation of choices that we keep coming back to, that like, look, that, you know, what it takes to get to that and that eschatological vision of all creation worshiping God together in the peaceable kingdom, it really does take an apocalypse, right? In the sense we tend to think of it. I mean, even as I've gotten older and I trend more in the direction of like Origin of Alexandria's kind of vertical eschatology of like, Origin doesn't think there's a historical parousia that's like coming at some point in the future. He basically thinks like, look, you die, you're immediately resurrected in a spiritual body, and you just kind of travel through the cosmos back to God. The older I get, the like worse the world gets, the more I trend in that direction as like a realism. I'm like, yeah, like that's probably more right than like the apocalyptic narrative. But also the older I get and the worse things get, the more I think to myself, I really want the apocalyptic narrative to be true.
Yeah.
Because like if it's not, like it would be really great if God would come and do some of this like smashing of the mighty and deprivation of the rich that he promises so frequently in scripture, right?
Yeah. And it's increasingly clear that that is actually what it would require. Like something that's so funny to me is like this consistent refrain among like typically white conservative men that, you know, if the government ever does XYZ, like good luck, we've got all our guns and we would definitely win that war. Remember the American Revolution. And I'm like, you have not paid attention to the news. If the military, if the government decides that it wants to crush you, it will do it in a heartbeat. It's not hard for them. Like the sheer amount of military strength it would take to actually inculcate an apocalyptic level revolution in a Western power like the United States is unthinkable. It does not and cannot exist.
It's certainly not from a grassroots kind of thing, right?
No.
Like it at this point, it really seems to me the only way that that's going to happen from within, like imminent to the cosmos, like short of some literal divine intervention into future history, which like, come Lord Jesus, right? But like short of that, it would literally take like the climate apocalypse actually happening, like, which it is happening, it's just happening like slowly, right? So it would take it having some kind of like crisis moment of like, you know, some huge cataclysmic disaster, or it would take aliens.
Yes.
which is one of the reasons that I actually like, I get a real profound delight, and I read this stuff with my students when I'm teaching them investigative journalism. Like I get profound delight out of all the stuff, out of all the UFO stuff that is in the cultural discourse right now, because I love the idea. I love the idea that there are people in the Pentagon who see UFOs that are like trolling around military bases and like nuclear sites and things, and they don't know what they are, but they do know that it's not us. And that makes them afraid. I'm like, yes. Like, I for one welcome our new galactic overlords. You know, I'm like, it can't be worse. It literally can't be worse.
No.
So I guess like that kind of leads into, I mean, like, let's talk about the future, which I do so often, I guess, because I hate myself. Like, so if the only point at which the mission really succeeds is some kind of like radical apocalyptic transformation of the culture, which short of Jesus coming back or short of a mass repentance of like everyone in the country, neither of which, I don't want to say neither of which, like both of which are impossible. I'll just say like neither of which seems likely right now, right? Like what are kind of the realistic goals of the movement at the moment? Like what are we just like working towards, racially speaking, in terms of like racial consciousness? What kinds of like tikkun or repair in Hebrew can we like realistically look forward to? Is like this is like a future we can work for?
Yeah. So I will answer it this way. I'm increasingly influenced by folks in what we might call Black radical tradition, as well as abolitionist thinking. And I say that because there's sort of a distinction, I would say, in this sort of movement between folks who are interested in primarily engaging the question of like, what can we gain in the immediate to near future? And like, what's the future that we are hoping to imagine? And because I am a pastor, I believe that my job is to help folks cultivate imaginations that are increasingly unburdened by white supremacy and capitalism and all of the other isms that sort of prevent us from being able to imagine better possible futures. So when it comes to questions of like what's realistic in the near future, I don't know. I think that particularly in the US, we have demonstrated a remarkable capacity on a national level for really stamping down and clamping down hard on progress, almost as a reflex. And it's fascinating if you sort of like try to trace like different sort of movements around particular issues of civil rights or racial justice, like the sort of automatic reflexive response to clamp it down is ubiquitous, but like the specifics are so interesting. So like right now, we have this whole thing about people being afraid of critical race theory as like the new reflex to respond to potential progress in educating young people about the legacies of racism in America. And so people are now afraid of a legal framework developed 30 years ago. Like that's not a congruous reflex, but it's a reflex, it's happening. And I have no clue what's going to happen as a result of that, though I will say that the prognosis doesn't look good because a lot of these bills are passing and it's becoming increasingly difficult for young people to have access. As hard as it was before, it's getting even harder for them to learn the truth about what has happened in our nation's history. So in the immediate to near future, I don't know. Though I will say I am particularly interested in continuing to remind people that like the way things are didn't have to be this way. Front of mind right now, because this is sort of what I've been reading and thinking about, is like police and prisons. And generally speaking, like when this sort of bubbled up in the culture, there was like, you know, this movement to defund and abolish the police. That like that phrase ran rampant for like 2 weeks, and then immediately you started seeing infographics of like, what do we mean when we say defund the police? We don't mean the police don't exist anymore. We just mean that they won't shoot you, or we just mean that they won't have as many money or tanks, or we just mean that there won't be as many cops. And it's like already within 2 weeks, any potential radical imagination has been curtailed by concerns about safety and security. And what I want to do is just sort of blow, at least particularly in my work in ministry and in education, is blow that back up and say, no. I really actually do mean abolish the police. The police don't have to exist. This was an idea that someone had, and it's really not working. So why do we need it? Pointing out things like, again, from this book that was really excellent to hear, is like, again, we think about abolition as a future where police don't exist, and people are like, that's impossible, that can't exist, there's no way, but it already exists. There are certain communities in the United States where if you go, you won't see a police officer ever, and no one needs to call the cops because there's no crime. Folks have healthcare, folks work good paying jobs, kids can play outside in the yard, and parents aren't concerned about danger. Like, people live police-free lives in many areas of the country. So in some places, we already know what it is like to live without police, and we know the conditions required to sustain that sort of life. And so that's not an immediate to near future sort of goal, but it's something that we've already achieved. And so I see sort of my vocation as reminding people of these small futures that we've already achieved and encouraging them to hold on to that and to resist the urge to clamp down on possibilities because they don't seem realistic. And to sort of, again, assuage people of the fears that are meant to keep us willing participants in this sort of neoliberal capitalism that we live within. So not being so concerned with material wealth and being concerned for your neighbor and like small things like that, that I think do some amount of significant work in helping us keep our eyes on the horizon.
It's interesting to me how much of like global flourishing and regional flourishing really does come down to like strong localism.
Yes.
Right? Like strong, like building stronger communities at the local level provides a model that helps us to think about larger communities in like meaningful ways. So I want to wrap this up for now, but like I hope you'll agree to do this again sometime. Both because I love you a lot and I like to see your face, not in like still form, you know, and not in those memes that our college friend periodically sends you on your page.
Right.
But also because, you know, I think this is, I mean, obviously we've only scratched the surface of a lot of these issues. I think by way of a last question, and you can make this about Spider-Man however you want to. So during Black History Month, I try to do like diverse English lit with students in accordance with this, you know, kind of public liturgical calendar of different people group months. And but one of the things that I found interesting to do last year was to teach Black History Month by reading Afrofuturist literature rather than by just reading, you know, I Have a Dream or Civil Rights or whatever. Not because those things aren't important, but because I think it's interesting that students don't think often of this idea that like everybody conceives of a future for themselves. It might be good, it might be bad, whatever it is, like everybody thinks of a future. I'm interested in like how to talk about imagination that's unburdened by like realism, right? How does like Afrofuturism factor into this, as far as you understand? And yeah, what do you think?
Lord, I will say you probably have read a lot more Afrofuturism than me. And this is a very actually specific intentional thing that is related to not Spider-Man, but the Star War.
The Star War.
So as we both know, we read a lot in graduate school, and I lost my love for reading pretty intensely through my time at Missouri State and my first year at Princeton. And then I discovered the world of illegal books on the internet. And I found a library of every single extended or Star Wars Legends novel available in ebook format. So I downloaded all of these to my phone. And pretty much for the past 3 years, I have exclusively in terms of fiction, exclusively read Star Wars Legends. So to answer the particular point about Afrofuturism, I don't know. I have a lot of friends who know, and I am down for any sort of Afrofuturist envisionings of the future. I just don't know that much about them.
My final point then on Star Wars, you need to get a Marvel Unlimited subscription on your phone and just read, like, spend all your time reading comic books, because that's what adults do. And then you need to read the High Republic comics that are going on right now, because they're focusing on this like other era of Star Wars history, right? And the main character that the comics at least are focusing on is like a female Black Jedi, basically, who becomes a Jedi. Her master is like a Trandoshan, so he's like a lizard man. But like, she becomes a Jedi, and they're not facing off against Sith. It's not like, it's very different. And I think you'd really dig it. Neil, let's do this again. Like, please do this again. You know, I just love you so much, and I'm really glad we got to do this. Thank you.
Me too. It's been a blast.
Yeah. See you.
Take care, mate.